What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Build in El Salvador show. Today, we have an excellent show lined up for you. We have Christian Blaze in studio to talk about El Salvador, the film industry, and some projects he's working on. So, Christian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Christian, let's get into your background. So, you're born in El Salvador?
Yeah, I was born here in '79, right when the Civil War started here. And my family moved to Canada when I was really young.
Was it the typical story to escape the violence? And
Yeah, it was pretty gnarly down here. I mean, you still, all I remember is like you still go to school, you still, had your regular life. But then from time to time, war stuff would happen. So like it would be normal to watch like tanks and stuff roll down the street, just like watching the jeeps and stuff. I remember as a kid, we used to play like with little like the plastic like soldiers. Like to us, it was just cool. Like we didn't understand what was really going on, right?
Yeah.
And then I remember I have a memory when I was living in we were living with my grandma, and she lived in a place called Ilo Vasco, which was like really hard hit by the war. And I just remember the power would go out and everyone would like go into like the room with the least windows. And that's because when the power would go out, they'd usually like cut it when there were skirmishes and stuff happening, and you'd hear the pa, 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 like the gun battles going on in the distance. And then I just remember as kids, like to me, it was kind of like a fun thing because you don't understand what's going on. So the kids are all like playing, and
I could imagine huddled up in a room having
and there's
fun.
candles and stuff, and you're
Yeah.
just running around, and the parents are all like hushed and like kind of whispering to each other. And
Yeah,
everything.
they take the burden of the stress on, right?
Yeah, because what you didn't want to have happen is like have a soldier or have like a guerrilla or whatever trying to get into the house, right? And then try and start stuff like if they're being chased or whatever and they chase them into the house, then someone could get hurt, someone could get shot or whatever. And then I remember hearing like the droning of like the planes, like I remember that, and then hearing bombs drop and it would shake like a little mini earthquake.
Wow.
So, but as a kid, it was just like normal, right? So you didn't know that it was not normal, right? Until when we moved to Canada and you start realizing, oh, there's no like bombs here, there's no like threat of people killing each other and everything.
And your parents are probably less stressed out as well. And
Yeah,
chill.
exactly. And I think honestly, if I look at it objectively, I think part of the reason that I'm a Bitcoiner and I research politics and like how money and everything works was probably because of that experience. Like it always stuck with me as a kid, and I wanted to understand why was El Salvador going through this war, right? And then you research, you read, you start learning like the different forces, and that it was a proxy war in essence. What's going on in Ukraine is basically what happened in El Salvador.
Yeah,
It's the same thing.
So, from my understanding, it was like the Russians, the kind of communist
Cuba,
faction,
Russians, yeah.
and then the U.S. got
and the
involved.
US, yeah.
And so it was basically that war against communism happening here in El Salvador.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you look around, you could just say that the U.S. won because now there's Pizza Hut here, there's McDonald's, there's like all that stuff. We have the U.S. dollar as a legal tender. So it didn't happen all at once, but basically over time, like you see the effects of the winning side, right?
Sure.
Like maybe if the U.S. wouldn't have won, it would have been like Cuba here. I don't know.
Yeah, that is an interesting thought. So at what age did you go to Canada?
7 or 8 or something like that.
Wow. So it was you had a formidable years spent here in El Salvador during the war. So I could imagine how that impacted you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what was life like in Canada, and what brought you back here to El Salvador?
So this is the second time being in El Salvador actually, because in Canada I mainly got into computers. So I remember like a lot of kids getting into like video games. Like back then, I think I had it wasn't an Atari, but there was like Intellivision, I think it was. It was like a knockoff, but it played all the Atari games. And I just remember being obsessed with how that worked. And so I wanted to know how to make video games. And so I remember really early on, I was like taking books from the library, like on basic programming. And I would go over to another friend. He had like um, one of those first computers. I forget what they were, but I'd sit there and type out like all the code, like line by line. It would never work because you make one little mistake, one dot, one period, one like semicolon or whatever wrong, and it's not working. So I remember always being frustrated, but I didn't give up. I kept like studying computers, and then we moved to Vancouver because somebody tipped my parents off that Vancouver was different than some of the other provinces in Canada, because we'd go vacation like in Alberta and Manitoba, and it was the same as Saskatchewan where we were, right? Because we initially went to Regina, and so it was like super cold during the winter, like minus 50 degrees with the wind chill factor, and super hot in the summers, right? For the few months that it was summer. And so somebody tipped them off that Vancouver was a nicer place to be. And so we visited one time and they were like, oh my God, this is winter. It's just like raining. It's still like above zero. And so then we moved there and I did some schooling there. I did grade 8 there. And then the war had ended in El Salvador, like in 92, I think. And in 94, my parents decided to move back because they missed El Salvador, right? And we drove down. We drove from
Wow.
Vancouver all the way to El Salvador. So driving through the States was easy and it was fast, except the engine melted in Nevada.
Yeah.
And then we had to get a new engine because the car was made for like snow. Engine melted, got a new engine, drove down. Mexico was super difficult. I don't know if it's different now, but driving through Mexico back then was just insane. You had to give bribes and stuff like at every stop. It was crazy. And then we eventually made it to El Salvador and then reestablished our life here. And I started going to school here. I did my high school at a place called Colegio Santa Cecilia, which is like, it was like an all boys Catholic school. But it's really well known, like really good programs and, fairly strict. But the students that come out of there, they're usually like, well
Educated, yeah.
Yeah. And so I studied as my elective electronic engineering was what I studied. That's where I learned more about, how electronic devices and stuff work. And at that time, El Salvador was mainly focused on training people for rebuilding a country, right? So construction, that's why electronic engineering, there was electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, that sort of stuff. Now there's more options and more opportunities, but at the time that was it. And then by the time I got to university, I did 1 year of university here at a place called La UCA, the University of Central America. And I felt like, because I had been studying computers all throughout this whole time, I felt like I could be teaching the class. Do you know what I mean? Especially with computers, because it's like the classes were like 2-3 years behind on the technology, and because I was in it, I just knew the latest stuff, right? And so one of the things I was doing then as a hobby was I was coding my own 3D engine to make video games still because I really love them. So I made a 3D engine from scratch where you can have like polygon based 3D stuff. But I coded all the math and everything myself, like learn how to multiply matrices together and plot points like from 3D to 2D and all that sort of stuff. And I was writing text files and plotting the vertices like manually to create boxes and different shapes and stuff to load into my program for my game. And I was getting tired of doing that. And that's how I started looking for 3D like design packages. And I found a piece of software called TrueSpace started using that to create like objects and loading them in. And that would eventually lead me to doing visual effects for film and TV.
Okay. So, when did you come back full time here to El Salvador? You said that was your first
So
trip back,
yeah,
right?
and then I moved back to Canada in like 1999, 2000.
Mhm.
And then when I was in Canada, I had gotten bored of all the computer stuff. So I actually ended up, I either wanted to go into film or I wanted to go into music. And I ended up going into film and studying acting, believe it or not.
Wow.
So I went from the technical side to the artistic side, studied acting, learned a lot that I didn't understand. Like I didn't have really an appreciation for what actors do, or like I just thought it was easy. You get up there, you know, you pretend to be somebody else, and you're done. But
Recite some lines,
yeah,
show some emotion,
Yeah.
or pretend to.
yeah. But I went to a place called Gastown Actor Studio in Vancouver, which was pretty famous back then. It doesn't exist anymore, but there were some pretty well-known Canadian actors that came out of there. And you know, every month you would get scene study, and so you'd get a scene from like a play or a TV show or a movie or whatever, and you'd have to break it down. So you had a character, and then you'd have to break down each line. You'd have to figure out what the past of the character was, what the motivation is behind each thing that they're doing. You build a character, you learn about psychology, like why human beings do the things that they do, and you do all this work. And then at the end, I remember I knew that I did a really, really good job acting if I didn't remember what I did in the scene, because you had to perform like a play, right? Like at the end of the scene.
So was it more like embodying the character?
Yeah, so like when you're in it, when you create a character, if you're in the scene as the character, you don't remember later on what you did. But all the stuff that you do to get to the point where you can create that character is kind of becomes like built in second nature. You know what I mean? Even if you add an accent or you add a certain like physical thing, like maybe the guy walks with a limp or something, you know what I mean? Like all these things, you consciously build them up over the course of the month, let's say. But then when you present it to the audience, if you've done a really good job, you don't even remember doing the stuff that you
It just
did.
becomes second nature.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so you kind of like, I don't know if it was Kanye West that said, like, my only regret in life is never being able to be in the audience to watch myself perform or something like that. As funny as it sounds, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because yeah, if you're doing a good job, you can't experience it. You're like in a different place.
Interesting. So,
So-
when did you return to El Salvador?
So after working in the film industry and everything in Canada, I never thought I was ever going to come back to El Salvador, because I mean, El Salvador was dangerous. From time to time, you know, I'd come back here and visit, like on vacation and stuff. But you know, in Canada, I got married. I have a daughter. We were living there. Everything seemed fine, and then Canada just started changing. It became really, really obvious when the whole pandemic happened. That's when it was already changing before, but then when the whole pandemic happened, it was just like a wake up call. It was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. And, you know,
When you say changing, are you talking about the politics or the ideology of the
Just-
people?
everything, I felt like Canadians protested everything before. And then when this thing happened with the pandemic, nobody could see, like, I felt like the way that I saw it, it was really obviously like
Tyranny?
yeah,
Perhaps?
it was like gaslighting on a massive scale. Do you know what I mean? It was gaslighting, it was lying, it was deceitful, it was to make money, like all these things. And it was very obvious to me, like, to see it. And I was surprised that nobody else, most of the country was like against anybody that was speaking out. And I was very vocal. My wife at the time was very vocal. And we basically I felt like we got ostracized. We were the minority. Like, in Canada, you couldn't even visit your family if you weren't vaccinated. You couldn't go to restaurants. There was even a time when they put like checkpoints based on your city and stuff to check if you're like traveling where you shouldn't be. And so it just became
I think we were
insane.
all worried for Canada
Yeah.
and Australia.
It actually gave me flashbacks to how it was in El Salvador during the war.
Wow.
So it was like a war, but a different type of war. Do you know what I mean? It felt more psychological. There's no bombs being dropped and stuff or anybody getting shot, but the psychology of it felt eerily similar. And so in 2021, like in October, well, when was it that they announced the Bitcoin law?
So yeah, I think September
right?
7th, 2021, I believe.
Yeah. So I watched Naive announce that they were gonna make Bitcoin legal tender, and I cried like because I didn't expect El Salvador. Like by then, I was totally into Bitcoin, and the way that I got into Bitcoin was interesting because I was a good programmer for the video game stuff. Someone in my early 20s or mid 20s actually recommended me to a currency trading firm that needed somebody. They needed their quant. I don't know. They needed a guy to come in and write algorithms to trade on their systems. And so they had like a Bloomberg terminal that had all this data coming in, which were super. I couldn't believe that you paid like 10 grand to get all this data. Like to me, this was so foreign. I didn't know anything about money, didn't know anything about finance. And so they bring me in and they're like, here's the information.
My favorite.
Here's the information. We want to make trades and make money based on this information we're getting and just buying and selling US dollars against Great Britain pound, euros. And so I worked with them for a while and necessarily I had to learn like what money was. I was interfacing with like APIs for banks and brokers and stuff like that. And the Bloomberg terminal and everything and writing algorithms and, having it trade automatically. And so I figured out a way that, you know what the non-farm payroll is? It's like a report that comes out.
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, it tells you like how many jobs were created that are non-farm, like technology and all this other stuff. And so I figured out that if the non-farm payroll expects like, let's say 100,000 jobs to be created, but then that's the expectation. But then when it actually comes out, let's say they lost 100,000 jobs, then the US dollar will usually drop against like euros or Great Britain pound or whatever. And so I found a pattern and I wrote a program that would basically go in and out and just take a couple pips and make a profit. And we were doing that and it was working and they were making money and they were like really happy. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my program started receiving a message when we would do the trades, and it was just like trade canceled or trade closed or something like that. I was like, that's weird. But then it happened enough times that I started calling the broker. The broker started telling me it's not them. It's coming from the bank that they deal with. And so they gave me a number to the bank. I start calling people at the bank and they start kind of like stepping me through. And eventually some executive at this bank that was blocking the trade basically said, he felt bad. He was like, look, kid, the bank reserves the right to cancel any trade they feel they're going to be on the losing end of.
Wow.
And at that moment, I just realized how rigged just everything is. And then by then I had learned so much, like, some systems are like running on COBOL and stuff. And like, there's some old mainframe probably holding like bank records and everything that's, at any moment can just like fry. So I started to see the fragility in the entire system. And then checks could, people commit fraud and, checks could, be checked by an employee and they type in the wrong numbers. Like everything just felt so fragile and low tech to me Do you
And
know
at
what
this
I
point,
mean?
you're not privy to Bitcoin yet, right?
No, but I just started to see like the holes in the financial system, that it just felt so, something that I felt was so solid in my mind before just became like so, I don't know, so wishy-washy. Do you
Sure.
know what I mean? And
Yeah, you start to lose trust and confidence
yeah,
in
I
the
just lost total trust, but there's nothing else, right?
Yep.
This is all there is. And then in 2008, there was a crash that happened. And as soon as the crash happened, I understood like I got it all, right? Like what was happening and why it was happening. And so I started looking for alternatives. I even thought about writing, like making a website for doing like barter. So instead of using money, you could just barter items, right? And then maybe it could have its own internal currency. But
Kind of
then,
like eBay without the dollar,
yeah,
right?
yeah. But then I started realizing that you couldn't really do something like that. Like there's so much regulations and everything that it's like, that's why people don't do it. And so I started looking online for information, and I stumbled across the Bitcoin Talk like forum.
Mm-hmm.
And then I start reading about Bitcoin. This was like I thought at first it was like 2012, but I've since like gone back and it was like 2011. So like quite early. And I start reading about it, and I even downloaded the mining software. And so I ran it for a while, but I didn't, I thought it was too complicated. I didn't feel like anybody was going to use this. So I kind of just put it away. Like, I didn't even care. Like if I mined anything, I didn't even, I didn't care for it. Like I didn't save anything. But then I couldn't get it out of my head. Like I would be at parties and stuff. Like I remember there was this one party, 2012, where it was like Mayan themed end of the world sort of thing. It was at a buddy's place.
Oh yeah, I
And
remember that.
I dressed up as like a Mayan, native, guy. And then looking back, it's ironic because all I was doing at the party was talking to people about, hey, have you heard about this Bitcoin thing? Like, like now I can see the interesting ness of being dressed as the Mayan native priest dude talking about like Bitcoin, you know what I mean, at the end of the world.
Yeah.
But I didn't even get it at the time. Like I was just like, have you heard about this thing called Bitcoin? Yeah, it's like this, and there's mining. I don't know, it's not gonna work, I don't think. But I couldn't stop talking about it, even though I was trying to rationalize, I think, why anybody would use it. And even though I was thinking nobody's going to use it, I couldn't stop talking about it. Do you know what I mean? It was one of those weird things. And then in 2013, they unveiled the first Bitcoin ATM in Vancouver. Like, I forget who was behind it, but I think Roger Ver was one of the owners eventually.
Might have been like a Lamasu Bitcoin ATM.
No. It was like Bitcoiniacs or something. I forget.
Okay.
But anyways, they had the first ATM. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, we have to go down there. So we went down there. My wife was pregnant at the time. And we were just like feeding money into this machine. And by then the bills, like the Canadian bills, were actually plastic, like polymer. They had changed them from paper to plastic. And so we're watching these bills go into the machine, and then Bitcoin's being sent, on chain to my wallet. And I just remember having this profound sense of like really seeing the Canadian dollars as just plastic, like pieces of plastic. Do you know what I mean? Like this is like I saw the whole system and how fragile it was. And then suddenly I'm seeing this new system where it's like,
very efficient.
It's a mathematical like imprint of something. Do you know what I mean? Like it's recorded in a way that nobody could easily take it down, right? Like no government, no corporation, no, not Google, not anybody. And even though at the time, I think maybe they could have, tried to shut it down at that time in 2013, but it would have been difficult even back then. And so suddenly, like Bitcoin to me just felt more real than the paper or plastic money that most people were using. And it just totally changed. That was the moment where the pin dropped and I was just like, oh my God. And then that's around the time that I started thinking, well, if you could do money this way, um, why not do entire nations this way, right? Um, the first time I mentioned it in public, or this idea, was actually what's the Ethereum guy's name?
Vitalik,
Buterin.
something like that.
He was doing a presentation because he was talking about how he wanted to do this new coin, Ethereum, decentralized computer system, blah blah blah. So he was doing a presentation at this underground like Bitcoin place, right? And people were asking him questions, and then I put my hand up and I said, "Has anyone thought about doing like a whole country or nation on the blockchain?" And the whole audience, you could visibly hear like the gasp, like they just realized, like, holy crap, like, that could happen. But yeah, that was around the time that I started thinking. I didn't think about this other idea that I was talking to you about, like this new constitution anchored in the definition of love thing. That came like later.
Okay, so let's get into you being here in El Salvador now, and
Yeah.
you're back in the film industry.
Yes. So I have a film production company. I'm rebranding it now. It's called the Blaze Luminaries Group. And the main goal that we have is we want to make a film, a very specific film. And then there's technology and stuff that goes along with this idea of the film. And there's also like this idea of creating this decentralized, very specific decentralized nation that's also related to this film.
Cool.
So I came down here in 2021, right when the whole pandemic thing was going on. Justin Trudeau came on the air and basically said, starting November 1st, I think, there's no outs. You can't get out of Canada without being vaccinated. I didn't want to get vaccinated. And the reason for it was because I was reading what Pfizer was saying and, what the governments were signing with them. And so it was very obvious to me, based on their own words, that one, they didn't know what they were doing. Two, they were protecting themselves from future liability. Three, it just, on so many different levels, it just didn't make sense to me. And so when we came down to El Salvador, I still wasn't sure. Like, you kind of have a feeling that this whole thing is like fake, like it's blown out of proportion. But there's still a piece of you that goes, what if, people are
You're talking
dying?
about the hype here in El Salvador?
Yeah.
Bitcoin country?
No. I'm talking about like the whole vaccination thing.
Oh, got you. Okay.
The COVID and all that. So when we got to El Salvador, there's all these Bitcoiners coming, right? One of the first places we went to was Max and Stacy. They had like a Bitcoin like meetup thing. And there were only very few people compared to how many people there are now. And this group is actually very strong because they're still here, a lot of them. They're like the OGs in El Salvador. But all these Bitcoiners that started coming down, and then soon after, a lot more came down. Nobody was vaccinated. Everyone was out, like, at all hours of the night partying and just having awesome time.
Must have been a big difference from Canada.
People are like hugging each other, like kissing each other. Like, yeah, you forgot what it was like to be in Canada with all the masks and all this restrictions. And then you realize, oh yeah, we're not dead. Like, no one's dying. Like, obviously there were still some elderly people that were dying and stuff like that, but they were dying all over the world anyways, of the flu, for example. Like, if you look at the statistics, same people dying of the flu were now dying of like COVID, right? So, I mean, most people, I think that's the thing. Most people weren't actually looking at the data because they were telling you, here's the data, and you could see the truth. They weren't hiding it. But then the politicians were coming out and telling a totally different story. Like, so politicians were saying one thing, but the actual data coming out was legit. Like, they were telling you it's, old people are dying mainly. We don't know what the vaccine is going to do. It might backfire. You might get heart attacks from it. You might get this blood problem. Like, as they were going and discovering stuff, they were just telling people this is what's happening. And they were changing the ingredients. Like, they would just release it publicly, but nobody read.
So
Like,
you're
nobody read.
here in El Salvador and to escape basically, and I would
Yeah.
imagine there are other people here as well to escape that tyranny.
Lots of people came with the same mentality, and so and Bitcoin kind of goes hand in hand because the reason a lot, or at least a lot of Bitcoiners believe, as I do, that a lot of these things happen not because people are inherently evil, but it's just the systems, right? Like the fiat system sets up the incentives to kind of make people act the way that we've been acting all over the world, right?
Mm-hmm. So you've been here since then?
Yeah, been here since then, and reestablishing basically the film production company that I had in Canada down here in El Salvador.
Awesome. And you produced kind of your first commercial?
Yeah. So I have a friend, Edwin, who's part of Jan 3.
Mm-hmm.
And he let me know about the Aqua Wallet, which is an awesome wallet, by the way. I love it. And so I was telling him, hey, you guys should do a commercial for the Aqua Wallet, because there's not like really high-end commercials for a lot of like Bitcoin companies. Like most of the marketing is pretty simple.
Sure.
So we were talking about it, and finally I convinced them, and then they went for it. And so we made this this commercial.
Shall we play it?
Yeah, let's play it. And this was all done here locally, all local talent. So in a way, it was also to prove that high-end film production can be created in El Salvador.
Yeah, I want to get more into that, but let's check out this commercial first. Oh, put our headphones on if you want. Very cool. So what's the concept here? Talk us through that commercial a little bit.
So basically, it's like this guy's doing a delivery, and he's going to this strange location in El Salvador. It's very abstract, but basically, I wanted kind of like the house to represent like the financial world or whatever, and how everything's an illusion, right? So we thought it would be something fun to have like these mermaids kind of like sitting there, kind of chilling and relaxing, and then you have one of the mermaids actually come up and start paying using the Aqua Wallet, right? Bitcoin. And then this, weird eye shows up, and it's looking back, and if you notice up close, it's got like a little dollar sign in the center. So that was like my representation of like, the IMF, the fiat gods kind of like getting pissed at, one of their
Like
users.
the Iosaurn, like
kind of like that. And then so he gets scared and he gets out of there. And then at the end, you find out the whole house disappears, right? But then he checks the transaction and it's written on the blockchain, right? So at least the transaction was real. And it just goes, it kind of like speaks to the fact that you can't really trust anything that's going on in the traditional finance system, right? And if anybody that's ever worked in finance, and the deeper you've worked in finance, like, the more the more of the technology you understand of the traditional finance world, it all just looks like a mirage to me, to be honest. And I'm pretty sure all the finance people feel the same way to a certain degree. And so when it just disappears, it's just like when there's a stock market crash, or when, there's the housing bubble, and you just feel like everything just poof. Those are the moments where everything just kind of like disappears. And so I think as we see more and more of those moments happen in the traditional finance system, the Bitcoiners are going to feel like this guy. You know what I mean? Where you're going to be able to check your transactions, and those are real. Those are all going to stay.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to be able to audit all that sort of stuff. You're going to be able to feel safe that's not going anywhere. That's not going to get frozen because some hedge fund did some crazy trades that all of a sudden your money is gone in some bank that you had your money in.
Very cool. So how do you see the film industry here in El Salvador?
So it's small, but the people that are in it are very talented, as you can see. Like these were all like Salvadoran crew and cast, most of them. There's a few foreigners in there, but they live here. They're Bitcoiners that have come to live here. But there's a lot of talent, because I think if you're in the film industry in El Salvador, because there hasn't been that many opportunities, you had to be good. Like you had to really want to do it. So
do you see it evolving?
I do. I see that there's a lot of potential. I think the main reason that not just the film industry, but other industries here in El Salvador, why they haven't really developed, is because there's all this talent in El Salvador, and it's like somebody had a lid on the boiling pot. Do you know what I mean? They had no escape because of the violence. The violence was basically like this thing that if you wanted to make something of yourself, you had to go somewhere else, like Canada or the States or wherever. And now that lid has been taken off. Thanks to the great work by Bukele's government, which, by the way, at the beginning I didn't think it was going to work, and I was against it. Like the whole state of emergency, or whatever it's called in English, but the state of exemption, I think it's called, that designated the gangs as like a terrorist organization. I didn't know it was going to work. But you can't argue with results. Like it's literally felt like a miracle. Like overnight, the whole country changed. I don't know if you ever came down here before.
No, I didn't.
It was a dangerous country. Like you had to watch your back. Like you couldn't go to half the country, like just because it was off limits. People were you'd see it in the news all the time. Dead people everywhere throughout the country. Right?
It's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, because you guys are here and it's like, oh, it's so beautiful and so nice.
Yeah. So it's hard to imagine the past, but from all the conversations that we've had,
Yeah.
it's the same story that it was.
Everybody had a story of getting a gun pointed at them and getting their car stolen or somebody they knew's car stolen. That was common. Like just stop at a stoplight, gun to the head, and car gone. Or people getting kidnapped for ransom was a big thing.
Wow.
And then you usually wouldn't see those people, even if you paid the ransom sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Like they just disappear people all the time. And it was just, part of life here. And it didn't look like it was ever going to change.
Yeah. And what do you see for El Salvador now? What future do you see for El Salvador?
I mean, if it keeps going the way that it's going, it's going to have a bright future, I think. I think the Bitcoin thing is an important piece. It's really early on, and a lot of Bitcoiners, not just Bitcoiners, but other people too, they get kind of frustrated that they feel like the Bitcoin experiment hasn't worked like they wanted it. Because I think a lot of people are expecting like, okay, and now everyone's going to be using Bitcoin like overnight, right? And it doesn't work that way. But out of all the countries that I've seen, I think El Salvador is like where Bitcoin is used the most. I mean, you're able to live here and just pay using Bitcoin. Like you don't need to touch dollars if you don't want. So whether it's like paying for your cell phone, internet, whatever, like you can pay with Bitcoin.
So is this where you call home now?
Yes, this is where I call home, and it's like my base, right?
Mhm.
So, my main goal now is I have a movie that I'm working on.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So as I've been working on all this Bitcoin and film stuff, I get ideas kind of come to me. And so I had this idea that's kind of been evolving over the past few years. And it's this idea of what would happen if you created a decentralized nation that had a new constitution, but the constitution was anchored in the definition of love. And then you built systems starting from that point. So the thing that I've noticed is like all over the world, most well, I guess all the different systems that we have, like the state, let's call it, they're anchored in the idea that they have a monopoly on violence. So at the end of the day, that's the way that I see the state is a entity that has evolved to help us deal with what happens when we choose violence or force, right? So like maybe when there wasn't a state before, we used to just shoot each other and steal from each other
To mediate disputes.
yeah,
right?
it's like, like the old westerns or whatever, just out on the street, turn around and boom, okay, you lose. Like I was right.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing is, I think, where the state comes from. And there was a time a long time ago, like I'm sure a lot of idealists think, oh, there must be a way to do it without violence, sort of thing, right? But over time, as I've grown wiser in my old age, I guess, I've come to feel like the state is almost like a necessary piece. You almost need it to exist because when people do choose violence, you want there to be an entity that's like an expert in violence, I guess, and deals with that accordingly. And there's all sorts of different systems that have evolved to kind of deal with that sort of thing. But what I'm proposing is you could have another jurisdiction. So you could have the jurisdiction of the state, which is a monopoly on violence, but you could also have another jurisdiction, which I think already exists. We just have to acknowledge it. And that is when people treat each other with love and kindness and respect and do things on a voluntary basis for each other. And I'm not saying that we're always going to live on one side, right? Like, I don't think anybody's perfect. And from time to time, we are going to jump into the jurisdiction of the state. But we should be aspiring to live in this other jurisdiction, right? And when I talk about love, I talk about it in a very specific way. So I started thinking about this movie, and that made me think about actually writing this constitution for real, right? Because then if I can write it for real, then you can write a whole story about how this would play out. And then the idea is to use the story to inspire people. Because you first see stuff in movies, I find, and then people go out and do them for real. You know what I mean? We were making movies about going to space before people actually went to space. And so my idea is to make this movie about these ideas, about this decentralized nation that's anchored in the definition of love, and have it inspire people to actually build it for real.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I'm here in El Salvador is because these ideas for parallel societies or parallel communities, it feels like it's very much in line with the Bitcoin ethos, right? And in a way, the Bitcoin protocol already allows people to operate in kind of this voluntarist fashion. It really like enables free markets and the free exchange of goods and services and even ideas. And it provides a platform where merit can rise to the top, right? Instead of force and violence. And so I saw El Salvador as a hub, potentially a signal out in the world for these people that are thinking outside of the box and want to build these kind of parallel societies and systems. So it's interesting to see this emerge.
Yeah.
Because one of the aspects that I realize is necessary for these like parallel communities or societies is there needs to be some kind of shared value system and shared principles. Otherwise, it kind of devolves into just people all going their separate ways, and there isn't like a cohesive philosophical structure that binds the community together. And so we've even thought of like, how would we construct a constitution and so forth. So it's interesting to see already progress being made in this regard where people are already thinking through the dynamics of what it will take in order to create this kind of, the way I see it, you're saying it's another jurisdiction to the state jurisdiction. I almost see it as a second layer where, you can operate on this, on these guidelines, on these principles, on these rule sets. And as long as you don't get to the level of violence, the interaction with the state then becomes minimal.
Yeah. I mean, that's my thinking on it is like, if we're able to operate in a way that we're being kind to each other and operating in this jurisdiction of love, let's call it, I think the state should have nothing to do with you. So if we could create a system where the state exists, as soon as you jump into violence against another human being or against whatever, or property or whatever, then you have systems in place that go and know how to deal with that sort of stuff, right? I don't think we need to abolish the state per se, just let it evolve in its own fashion. But then I think people should be open to the idea that if you decide to resolve your disputes in this other jurisdiction where you're treating each other with respect, everything is voluntary and everything, it should be outside of the state.
Interesting. And so you're like basically codifying that into some type of rule set.
I think it already exists because if you think about it, like let's say I crash my car into your car, right? You have the choice to go report it to the police and do this and do that. And, it goes down that path.
Matt and I have some experience with this. I won't get into details, but yeah, we settled the dispute outside of any legal.
Yeah. Or you could just settle it with somebody like, acknowledging the different things in a voluntary way. The difficult part is that sometimes somebody chooses to go down like the state path, right? And sometimes once you get into it, it's hard to get out. Like it's almost like the current system rewards doubling down. And you notice all the politicians, all the business people, everyone always doubles down. So when they're wrong, they don't jump out of it with like humility and and say like, hey, maybe I made a mistake.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I haven't gotten involved in legal disputes, although I was wronged, just because I know that once I enter that system, it like sucks you in,
Totally
and
does.
it's
Yeah.
just one thing after another. And then all of a sudden you've devoted, you know, quality hours, days, weeks, even
Yeah.
months towards a system for a dispute, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things, when you think about life being short, was it really that important to devote all that time and energy towards trying to get your
Totally.
way?
And that's what, when I said that the legal system seems to be built in such a way to slow down time, to give the participants time to think, and the state time to figure out how they're going to use force, right? At the end, if it goes down that path. Because otherwise, what would happen is people would be at each other's throats, right? Like if you didn't slow that time down and give them time to send evidence and go back and forth and see who's telling the truth and who isn't. Um, so I see value in it on a certain level if people decide that they want to be using force, right? So it's like a mechanism to try and make it less chaotic, right? But I also see value in having an alternate jurisdiction.
You know, it'd be interesting with something like this, and you know, I haven't really given it much thought, but I would imagine it being some type of network which people can just opt into. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, cool. Christian is in this, let's just call it love network, where they operate by a set of rules and principles. So I know if I deal with Christian, right, this is kind of his guiding principles. This is how he's going to settle things. This is how he thinks about things. And so it already establishes some type of ground rules for the relationship going forward.
Yeah. So the way that I've kind of been thinking about this is you could write a constitution in such a way, it's almost like you're just acknowledging that this exists. So the first thing that I want to do, very simple, actionable step, I guess, is kind of like what you said, make some sort of app where you have like some private key or something like that. And all you're doing is voting on whether you believe that love is like the number one, like overarching, like law, let's call it, right?
Now, when you say love, sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
but it's a pretty ambiguous term. I think
is.
you went for the first time and kind of presented this idea to a crowd, and you got kind of a mixed reaction.
Yeah. So if you want, we can go through the definitions because I have defined the actual definition. So I'm gonna explain a little bit. It's not too many of them, but
Sure.
so I went even back as far as like starting with existence because people are gonna argue about what that even is, and I try to make it like as simple as possible. And basically, like existence is defined as the quality or state of having the potential to be observed. So if something can be observed, measured, whatever, like it exists, right? So, and people can argue whether something can be measured or not into infinity, I'm sure. But that's basically where we're starting. And then I define what a being is. And it sounds very like low level programming, I guess. We're going down to like very low, simple terms, but it makes sense like once you get into it. So a being is basically like anything that exists, technically, right? And then conscious
Doesn't have to be conscious.
no, so in this in these definitions, a being is just anything. So it's like being. So this phone is being. Like it's existing. Do you know what I mean?
Gotcha.
So I'm defining it as anything that exists, a thing that exists, right? And then consciousness I define as the potential to perceive or become aware of a being. So when something has the potential to become, like even this cup, if this cup can become aware of this phone in some way, there's consciousness there. So if you think about it that way, like I think consciousness is probably prevalent in everything.
Yeah. If it's defined like that, then artificial consciousness already exists.
Probably, yeah.
Yes.
And then we go down to conscious, and conscious is just this quality or state of actualizing consciousness. And then a conscious being would be a being that is conscious. Obviously, it's super simple. But this is like legal, right? So you have to like define these things. Like lawyers, they would look it up, and I don't think anybody's ever done something like this, like write it out in legalese, right?
And so you have this on a GitHub.
Yeah, yeah.
Can people contribute?
Yeah. I mean, was a response to a submission for projects, but what's probably going to happen is I'm going to start a new one just for the Constitution itself. So it doesn't have to do with any other project. So then the next one is conscious observer is a conscious being as a subject in their awareness of a being. So you have like, if I'm observing this cup, then I'm a conscious observer of the cup, right? And then a self is a conscious observer as the object in their own reflective awareness. So when I'm watching this cup and I become aware of myself, visualizing or looking at the cup, the thing that I think is looking at the cup, that is yourself, right?
Interesting.
So you're seeing yourself, seeing the cup. And then free will is a self's perceived potential to perform actions that the self cannot predict and that are free from exclusive or complete determination by any other being. And the reason that I wrote the self's perceived potential is because some people don't even believe that free will exists, right? But if you perceive it as such, like if it is like something you perceive, I'm defining it as that. So that even includes people that don't believe in free will. You could have that definition and be like, well, maybe it doesn't exist, but I do perceive it like it feels like I'm making my own choices, right?
Sure.
And then that leads us to self-purpose. The free will formulation a self believes to be the purpose of its own existence. And that's something that each one of us defines for ourselves. So like I have reasons that I think I'm here for, you have reasons you think you're here for. Everybody has their own like reasons. And that can evolve too. Like it might be one thing when you're born, it might be like a totally different thing.
Sure, you go through a transformation process through life.
And the reason that all this is important is because eventually we get to the definition of selfless act. And a selfless act is a free will action performed by a self, the selfless actor, with the intention of helping realize the self-purpose of another conscious being, the selfless act beneficiary, and is perceived by both at the time of its execution as providing no direct or indirect benefit to the selfless actor and is detrimental in some way to the selfless actor. Now, the interesting part with this is like if you do a selfless act, I don't know whether a purely 100% selfless act even exists.
Sure, because you
like
get some satisfaction.
something. Yeah, I feel like it's like the speed of light. The closer you get to like 100% selflessness, the harder it is. Like it's impossible, right? But I have it in here because I think as a concept, we can all kind of feel like it's something that exists in their mind. And so that leads us to love. And love, I define as the self's desire and perceived potential to perform actions that aspire to be selfless acts. You don't have to get there. They just have to aspire, right? And then we get to act of kindness, which I think this is where we can actually live. An action inspired by love, performed by a self, the kind actor, with the intention of helping realize the self-purpose of another conscious being, the kind act beneficiary, and is perceived by both at the time of its execution as providing a larger benefit for the kind act beneficiary than for the kind actor. So if I give you food, for example, I'm losing something, I'm doing it out of kindness for you. That's a kind act. And that's, I think, where we should aspire to live. You know what I mean?
Yes. It's interesting. I wonder in what way this can just be incentivized through systems and structures itself.
Exactly. And I think the start of it will be the start for me was writing out these definitions because it's never been a part of any legal system that I know on earth. Yet I think that this, like love defined as we have it here, I think is probably one of the most important things to a lot of people. You know, as I saw, like I was at the Palo Verde meeting and I was kind of like explaining all this to the crowd there and like the ideas and the movie that I want to make and everything. And I was nervous and my heart was racing because this was the first time that I was going to do this. I wanted to find out for my own self how many people in the audience actually believe love to be like the top law. And I even prefaced it by saying it doesn't mean that you act in this way, because I surely don't. Like I don't act selflessly like most of the time. I'm just like everybody else. Like I fuck up all over the place. But deep down inside, I feel like love is like the number one arching law.
It's what you're
right?
striving for, right? It's
What we should be striving
the
for.
highest value that you've set at the top of your value hierarchy.
Yeah. And so I said, how many here see it like that? That love is kind of like the top law, right? And half the people in the audience put up their hand, which was a shock to me in itself, because I didn't know if it was going to be, I probably thought it was going to be less than that. And it was half the people. And then out of that half of them were kind of like sheepishly putting it up, like kind of looking like, are other people putting it up? Like 25% put their hand up, like just straight away. And then another 25% were kind of like sheepish and like, okay, yeah, I see enough people putting it up, I'll put it up. And then the other half of the room didn't put their hands up. But I looked at their faces, and what I saw was that they were visibly moved by seeing the other people in the room put their hands up. I don't think they realized. So I believe in this stuff, and I thought it was going to be a few people. Imagine how little people that don't believe in love think other people believe in love. Probably like nobody. Do you know what I mean? And also I looked at some of their faces, and to me they seemed sad. You know what I mean? Almost sad to realize like I'm surrounded by people that believe in love, but I don't. And so I made a comment. I said, just because the people that haven't put their hands up, I said, maybe they don't feel like they believe that love is like number one. It doesn't mean they're bad people. I said, most likely, I think maybe they've been shown a world where love hasn't won. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they've just been, that's their experience.
So what's the idea for the movie on top of this then?
So the movie idea is basically very connected to this. There's a small group of people that get together and write this constitution, and they try to create a society, like a decentralized nation.
So it's basically telling the story of this idea through some type of visual format, right?
Like a feature film.
Sure.
So they start basically living their lives anchored to this constitution that's anchored to the definition of love. And so they start creating all these different systems. It's more based on like voluntarism and all this stuff. Like new technologies emerge from it that help them kind of like organize themselves in a totally different way. But then they catch the eye of the state, because the state doesn't feel like what they're doing should be permissible, because it's, messing
So there's
with
the conflict in the story.
Yeah, and so they come in, and most of this film takes place in a makeshift hospital where they're getting people that don't have the means to heal themselves. They're going to this hospital where people are volunteering and they're healing people, right? But they're doing it totally outside the system. They're not doctors, and they're using like controversial stuff, like for example, using psychedelics to treat addiction and that sort of stuff. They're printing like prosthetic arms and stuff, and
so it's a complete like self-sustaining community that's being built around this constitution.
So it's just kind of like percolating and growing.
Man, you know what? I think that's a great idea, because a lot of the sci-fi films and sci-fi books from like the 60s are now becoming reality.
Yeah,
but somebody had to like
come up with the idea.
So
now we have the ability to imagine the
a better
type
world
of future that we want.
Yeah.
So why not write a really cool story? And here's the other thing too. We're at a perfect time to tell these type of stories, because as you've been watching, there's like wars all over the place. We're on the brink of nuclear disaster. There's all this shit happening everywhere. And but I don't necessarily see it as a, you have to see the opportunity, because we live in a dualistic world. Like you can't have white exist without having black. You can't have cold without having hot. You know what I mean? Like everything has its opposite to exist.
The sweet is not as sweet without the sour.
Exactly. And so once you kind of understand that about reality, like we live in a dualistic reality, the fact that there's all this stuff that is horrible, you could say, happening all over the world is fertile ground to be able to live and be able to act on love and respond to it based on love, right? And then you get to tell these stories that are amazing. not just like as a movie or whatever, but also like in real life.
So if somebody wanted to get involved, how could they get in contact with you, and how can they get involved with the project?
They could go to blazeluminaries.com, or they could follow me on Twitter, Christian Blaze. And on Instagram, it's mr.christianblaze. That's probably the best, is to contact me through there, or they can send me an email at chris@christianblaze.com. That's another way.
Awesome. Any other parting thoughts? Anything you want to leave our audience with before we close off here?
Yeah. I think we're at a really interesting time in just the history of humanity. And even though, some things look pretty dark, as the cliche goes, it's usually darkest before the dawn. So I hope that there's enough of us that see that dawn coming, that we can all work towards, preparing the world for this dawn and not get sucked into all the dark stuff that's happening.
Beautifully said. Yep, I concur. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining. This was an excellent conversation. Christian, thank you for coming. And we'll see you on the next one.